But one thing is, I think this is an attempt at trying to dismantle the Iranian regime. If the initial reports are accurate, that the area that has been targeted is in downtown Tehran, in the Pastor area, which houses the office of the Supreme Leader, the office of the Supreme National Security Council, the presidency, and a lot of other important government offices. It does appear that this is really a decapitation attempt and trying to get rid of the Islamic Republic.
And what we're hearing from Iran is that Ayatollah Khamenei is not in Tehran this morning there. What kind of response could we see from the Iranian government?
Well, look, unlike last year, the Iranians have been anticipating this strike, so there is no element of surprise. And they were preparing for a very harsh response. The calculus there is that, last year they responded against Israel in a significant way and caused a lot of damage on Israeli territory. But in response to the United States, they were much more cautious. They struck a U.S. base in Qatar, but there were no American fatalities. And the conclusion in Tehran was that this Iranian restraint was interpreted by the Americans as weakness and is only going to invite more aggression. That is why they were going to respond in a harsh way, trying to spill American blood and inflict even more harm on Israel in order to restore a degree of deterrence. So I do think that we should anticipate a very harsh Iranian response, which could turn this conflict into a regional conflagration with disastrous implications for all.
We saw Iran carry out military exercises in the Strait of Hormuz during the midst of those discussions with the United States. As you mentioned, there was that strike it carried out on a military airbase, US military airbase in Qatar. Just talk to us about what Iran could potentially do in retaliation.
So since Israel is the aggressor here and has started this war, I think we can anticipate hundreds of missiles, Iranian ballistic missiles, supersonic missiles, targeting Israel in the next few minutes or hours. That's step number one. If the U.S. has indeed been involved by firing cruise missiles, then I think it is very likely that the Iranians would target U.S. naval assets in the region. It is also possible that Iran would target U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria. And if this crisis escalates further and Israel and the U.S. target Iranian infrastructure, energy infrastructure or other infrastructure, then you can expect that the Iranians would target gas fields or energy infrastructure in the region, U.S. bases in the Gulf, and also put pressure on oil exports and energy exports out of the Persian Gulf. And then finally, if it becomes an existential battle for the Islamic Republic, one can anticipate that the remnants of Iranian network of proxies in the region would also join in. So you would have Hezbollah started firing missiles towards Israel. You would have the Houthis in Yemen putting pressure on free flow of commerce out of the Red Sea and Bab el-Mandeb. And finally, you might even have the Iraqi militias who so far have stood aside, jump into this conflict, again, for their own, because everybody sees it as an existential battle for their own sake.
Ali, I just want to interrupt you just for a second to bring this breaking news coming into us from the Reuters news agency. A US official confirming to them that US strikes on Iran are now underway. So we've been following these Israeli strikes on Iran, but now confirmation from the US that its own strikes on Iran are now underway. What's your reaction to that?
Well, it was, as I said, it's not surprising that the U.S. is involved. The U.S. has amassed enormous firepower around Iran, unlike in last year's war, where it had to fly its B-2 bombers all the way from U.S. territory, U.S. soil, for 36 hours to bomb Iran for 45 minutes. This also indicates that the U.S. is prepared for a much more sustained and extensive military campaign. So this is unlikely to be a matter of a few hours or maybe a few days. It might be a long, multi-week bombing campaign, which, again, as I said, could escalate very quickly. And also, we have to remember the implication. This is the second time that in the middle of the negotiations, the U.S. has bombed Iran. That means that the value of diplomacy with the United States, I think, would completely vanish in the minds of the Iranians.
We have been preparing for strikes like this to happen, but the question still remains, what is the goal of strikes like this? There hasn't been a real conversation, perhaps, about what a future Iran could look like. Is this a short-term strike? What will be the impacts of that on Iranians and on the region? The fact that we haven't had that extensive conversation, how concerning is that for you?
It is very concerning because this is a war in search of a strategy, in search of an objective. Reality is that, again, if you look at the rhetoric from Washington and Jerusalem after last year's war, it was full victory, that all the objectives were achieved. Iran's nuclear program was set back, Iran's missile program was degraded, and it appeared that the problem was put in the back burner for a long period of time. And yet we're at it again in 8 months. This time around, I think it really boils down to a simple fact. Israel and the US saw an opportunity in Iran being relatively weak and want to finish the job that was not finished last year. It is also important to note that based on international law, this is illegal. Based on US law, this is illegal because President Trump had to go to Congress to explain what are the objectives, why he believes that he needs to go to war with Iran again, and get authorization. None of this has happened. There's been no serious policy debate about this in the United States, and yet we're in the middle of another war, which could cost American lives and have implications for the region and beyond for another generation.
We saw during the negotiations that had been happening, the US and Israel raising concerns about Iran's nuclear program, its ballistics program, as well as, and also its support of proxy groups in the region. Do you think Iran could have compromised on those points with the US and Israel?
Look, it was unrealistic to expect Iran to capitulate to all of the US demands at the negotiating table. But as the foreign minister of Oman was in Washington yesterday and had a meeting with Vice President Vance and did engagement with the press in the US explained, they were making good progress. I do believe that the Iranians should have been more flexible, but I also do believe that diplomacy needed a little bit more time, and there was a solution available that was much less costly for all sides than engaging in a risky gambit of war. Hoping that it would result in any kind of soft landing and a better situation. Look, these wars, especially when they cause a high number of civilian casualties, they also create instability, radicalization, terrorism, and the implications, again, could go well beyond the short-termism that we're all focused on. And at the end of the day, there's tension between the rhetoric from Washington and Jerusalem saying that Iran was weakened significantly, and yet there was such an imminent threat that it required another